The girl had not touched her. That was what made it worse. A single drop of rinse water had leapt from the copper basin, crossed the morning light of the dressing room, and landed on the narrow strip of bare blue skin between Princess Silura's jeweled waist chain and the deep crimson fold of her skirt. It was hardly anything. By the time it slid, it had already begun to dry. The room went still around it. Silura lowered her eyes to the spot as if it were a wound. Her black hair had been brushed until it fell in a dark river down her back. Gold combs and red stones had been set into it with mathematical care. Her short formal blouse, stiff with embroidery, left her midriff bare in the old royal fashion. Over it the layered skirt fell in precise, heavy pleats, crimson against the pale blue of her skin. She looked, as sorrow liked to say, made rather than born. The servant holding the basin was young enough to still have softness in the face. Not a child, exactly. Old enough to know the danger of silence, and too frightened to use it well. "Highness," she whispered. Silura held out 2 fingers. No one in the room moved to help the girl understand. That was another lesson. If you served in royal chambers, you learned quickly or you learned painfully. The servant set down the basin. Her hands were raw along the knuckles from washing salts, the skin whitened and split. She stared at Silura's outstretched fingers and then, after one terrible beat, placed into them the linen square from her belt. Silura let the cloth fall. "No," she said, "that cloth has been in your hand." The girl went the color of old milk. Silura turned to the line of attendants near the wall. Who trained her? No one answered. No one would. To volunteer guilt in a royal room was to write it down in ink. The servant dropped to her knees so suddenly the basin rang on the floor. "Mercy, Highness, I will fetch another. You will not leave a stain drying on royal skin while you run errands." Silura's voice was never loud when she was cruel. That was part of why it carried. She pointed to the fallen linen. "Use your hair." A flinch went through the room, tiny, almost elegant. The servant looked up, then down again at once. She had long, dark hair braided for work, already damp at the ends. With shaking fingers she pulled the braid loose. It fell across her face and shoulders. She leaned forward and pressed it awkwardly against the drop on Silura's skin. Silura did not step back. She stood very straight and watched the girl work, watched the humiliation settle fully into her. "There," Silura said when the skin was dry. "Now you will remember distance." She turned away while the servant was still kneeling. One of the older women resumed fastening the bracelets at Silura's wrist. Another bent to retrieve the basin. The servant remained on the floor because no one had told her she might rise. Silura could feel Saral's approval before she heard his voice. "Your father would have admired your composure," the chamberlain said. That more than anything was why she did not look back. Her father had once mistaken nearness for virtue. He had stepped down from the high dais of the petition court because a minor's son was crying with a broken arm and the guards were slow to make way. He had gone himself, robed and jeweled and foolish, to kneel beside common pain. The minor had not drawn the knife, his wife had. Not a blade, even. A ceramic sliver hidden inside her sleeve, sharp enough for one determined thrust into the soft place under a royal jaw. Silura had been 14. She still remembered the sound her mother made. It was not a scream. It was something worse, a small, shocked inhalation, as if the world had become airless all at once. Her father had died before they got him back behind the doors. Afterward, Queen Nallery had not wept where anyone could see. She had rebuilt the court instead. Distance became doctrine. Touch became law. Rank was no longer only worn, It was defended at the length of an arm, the width of a stair, the angle of a bow. Warm rulers died. Accessible rulers bled. Those truths were set into Silura as firmly as the gold at her wrists. If a servant left her chambers with shame in her throat and caution in her bones, that was not cruelty. That was education. By the time the human arrived at court, the incident with the basin had already passed into routine memory for everyone except, perhaps, the girl who had used her own hair as cloth. Humans, Silura had been told, were practical creatures from a wet world who built ugly machines that continued working after elegance would have failed. They traded well, repaired quickly, survived more than they should, and attached moral language to labor in a way Silura found slightly obscene. They praised endurance. They praised caretaking. They even praised those who cleaned filth, as if naming a thing dignified it. Queen Nallery wanted one. Not as an advisor. Certainly not as an equal. A frontier relay station had suffered a pressure fire 2 months earlier, and a human relief ship had reached it first. The casualty reports were irritatingly impressive. Workers that palace physicians had marked beyond recovery had lived long enough to be transferred. Burns had been cooled properly. Airways had been kept open. Fluids had been rationed by need, not rank. It had made the outer governors talk. Nallery hated unsupervised admiration more than she hated novelty. So a human medical specialist was requested under the language of exchange and posted, with great care to every clause that mattered, not to the royal physicians but beneath them. Technical observer, emergency consultant, no authority over household practice, no independent staff, no right of audience unless summoned. His name was Martin Reyes. Silura disliked him at once for reasons too various to be cleanly listed. He was not handsome in any theatrical way that could be dismissed as vanity. He was 30-something, dark-haired, narrow-faced, brown-skinned, and built like a man used to lifting awkward weight rather than displaying himself. He had a medic's bag that looked too old to be impressive and a posture that annoyed her, not deferential, not insolent, merely steady. He did not try to seem small in the palace. He simply seemed uninterested in its scale. On his first day, Sorrel brought him to the East Audience antechamber and recited the restrictions while Silura listened behind a carved screen. No direct physical contact with members of the royal line without express order, the chamberlain said. No treatment of palace labor without clearance from the resident infirmary. No storage alterations in the lower clinics, and no wandering. "I understand," Martin said. His voice was ordinary. That irritated her more than an accent would have. She had expected more foreignness. Sorrel continued, "You will address the princess as Highness. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will remember that efficiency does not excuse impropriety." "I understand that too." There was no defensive edge in it, no apology either. Silura stepped from behind the screen because she wanted to see whether his face would shift. It barely did. Surprise, yes, then attention, then stillness again. He bowed correctly after only the briefest delay, which meant he had studied. So she made him regret it. "You have served in triage holds and burned stations," she said. "I read the summaries. Very admirable. You must be relieved to find cleaner work." "If there is cleaner work here," he said, "I haven't found it yet." Sorrel's head turned a fraction. Silura felt something dry and sharp uncurl inside her. "Are humans always witty when they enter service?" she asked, "or only when they have mistaken where they are?" "No mistake, Highness." He said it without lowering his gaze too far. Not challenge, not submission, infuriatingly balanced. She dismissed him with a flick of her fingers, already certain he would either grovel or offend within the week. Instead, 3 days later, she found him in a laundry alcove on his knees with a worker's hand in his lap. The palace laundry terraces were beneath notice, except when something arrived late or smelled wrong. Silura crossed them that afternoon only because a seam in one of her ceremonial veils had been repaired badly enough to warrant contempt in person. She moved through steam and heat, and the sour sting of washing salts while the workers shrank away from the line of her crimson skirts. Then she saw him between two cisterns, half in shadow. It was the same basin girl from the dressing room. Silura knew her by the frightened set of the mouth. One of her palms was split deeply across the base of the thumb, angry red around the crack, the skin along the fingers roughened into scales by alkali and heat. Martin was rinsing the wound with a bulb syringe and a bowl of clear water, not perfumed wash, not spirit, clean water. The girl hissed. "I know," he said, "better now than infected later." He patted the skin dry with cloth so plain it must have come from his own stores. From a small jar he spread a thin amber layer over the split. "Honey," Silura realized after a moment, and nearly laughed at the peasant simplicity of it. Martin wrapped the hand with gauze and began tying it off, 2 days out of the salts. The girl looked horrified. "I can't." "You can if I say. You'll lose use of the thumb otherwise." "My supervisor will dock me." "I'll talk to your supervisor." Silura stepped fully into the alcove. The workers nearby dropped their eyes so hard it was almost a sound. "And on whose authority," she asked, "do you bargain away palace labor?" Martin rose at once, but not so fast that he dropped the girl's hand. He finished the knot first. That detail lodged somewhere in Silura's mind and stayed there against her will. "Medical judgment," he said. "You have none here." "Yes." "She has a deep skin fissure and chemical irritation. If it keeps opening, it will seed infection." The words were plain, unscented by performance. Silura looked at the servant girl. "What is your assigned name?" The girl swallowed. "Lane 3, second wash, Highness." "Not a name, then, a placement, as usual." Silura turned her eyes back to Martin. "You waste good bandage on laundry stock." "Good bandage is cheaper than a crippled hand." "Cheapness is not your concern." He could have bowed and backed away then. He could have pleaded ignorance of custom. Instead he said, "If I'm here to be useful, this is useful." There were 15 ways to punish that sentence. Sorrel would have found 20. Silura chose contempt, because contempt was light to carry. "How tender your species is with other people's servants." Martin's expression did not change much, but something in it hardened into shape. "They're not stock to me, Highness." He said it quietly. The girl's injured hand trembled in its white wrapping. Silura let the silence stretch until the laundry workers looked near collapse. Then she smiled, small and cold. That is the sort of statement made by men who will someday be shocked by how the world is organized. She turned and left before he could answer, the heat following her like breath. That evening she told Sorrel about the incident because she wanted the human curtailed and because, if she was honest, she wanted her own distaste confirmed. Instead, the chamberlain frowned in calculation. If he keeps the workers from becoming unusable, he has value. Silura stared at him. "You approve." "I approve outcomes, not sentiment." Sorrel adjusted the cuffs at his wrists. "Sentiment is what makes outsiders sloppy, but skilled maintenance has always had a place." "Maintenance," she repeated, satisfied by the word. Yet the next morning, when the same laundry girl passed at a distance with her hand bandaged and held carefully dry against her chest, Silura recognized the white cloth before she recognized the face. That irritated her all day. The second time Martin became difficult to dismiss. It cost him something real. A heat swell rolled through the lower ventilation galleries just before the founding rites, when half the palace was being sealed and polished for ceremony. The duct crews worked deeper than usual, clearing ash filters and heat laces, while the upper halls filled with perfume and silk. By sunset, 3 laborers had collapsed. By midnight, 11. Palace physicians recommended rotation, rest, and improved prayer. Martin went below with water tablets, salt, sugar, cooling cloths, and 2 orderlies borrowed from the shuttle dock. Silura learned this because he failed to appear at the formal supper, where the foreign specialists were expected to stand in decorative attendance behind the governor envoys. Sarul took personal offense. He was specifically instructed to remain available, the chamberlain said at table, keeping his voice low. Instead, he has placed himself in the exhaust galleries among sweeps. Queen Nallery continued eating. Did anyone order him down there? No, Majesty. Then either he is foolish or useful. Determine which tomorrow. Silura said, he disobeys because he wants to be seen disobeying. Perhaps, Nallery said, dabbing her mouth. Or perhaps he comes from a culture that mistakes intervention for virtue. Her mother said such things without heat. That was always worse. Nallery had taught an empire that contempt need not raise its voice. Silura might have let the matter rest if sleep had come easily. It did not. The upper palace was too warm, the founding banners too bright in memory. Near dawn, restless and unadmitted even to herself, she took the service stair with only 1 guard at her back and went down toward the lower galleries. The air changed by degrees. Perfume left first, then the polished quiet, then the assumption that every space existed for appearance. The ventilation ward was a stone room lined with pallets, wet cloths, open basins, and workers who smelled of metal dust and overheated bodies. Martin was at the far end, sleeves rolled above the elbows, shirt damp across the spine. He was teaching a sweeper to pinch a laborer's forearm skin and watch how slowly it settled. Too slow, he said. That one drinks first. The sweeper nodded, terrified of getting it wrong. Martin moved to the next pallet. An old worker vomited between his knees before anyone could turn him. One of the palace orderlies recoiled. Martin did not. He caught the man forward, supported the chest, weighted it out, wiped the mouth, and handed the orderly a cloth. Clean him, he said. Then the floor. If he aspirates, we lose him. When the orderly failed to move, Martin took the cloth back and knelt himself. Silura stood in the doorway and watched the human, officially attached to the court of the radiant line, wiping sick off the stones with his own hands. There was nothing glorious in it, nothing to make a witness admire him except the fact that he kept doing it. One of the laborers on the pallets recognized her and tried to rise. Martin put a hand on the man's shoulder without even turning his head. Stay down. The laborer obeyed the human before he obeyed the princess. That should have angered her more than it did. Martin finally looked up and saw her. For a fraction of a second, he seemed only tired. Then he got to his feet. Highness, you miss a supper for this. Yes. Was it worth offending half the diplomatic wing? A strange expression crossed his face. Not insolence, more like a man deciding which truth could be afforded. 3 of them would have been dead by midnight if they stayed in the ducts, he said. So yes. A princess properly raised might have made an example of him there. Silura nearly did. The words had gathered. Then the old worker he had cleaned began shivering so hard his teeth clicked. Martin moved before Silura could speak, tucking dry cloths under the man's arms, lifting his head enough to make him drink from a cup in careful sips. "Slow," he said, "not all at once." The man drank. Silura left without dismissing anyone. Behind her, she could hear Martin telling a boy no older than 15 how to stir water with measured sugar and salt until it tasted, in his words, like tears, not soup. Later she learned he had missed his one scheduled transmission, window home to stay in the ward through morning. It should not have mattered to her that he had given up something of his own. It mattered anyway. By the time she tested him, she had already begun explaining him away. He was building a reputation among workers. Humans liked loyalty from below. Perhaps he intended leverage. He wanted to embarrass palace practice, to prove his methods superior. Perhaps he meant to return home with stories about soft-handed royalty and win promotion from them. There was always an angle. Kindness without angle was idiocy, and Martin Reyes did not look like an idiot. So she summoned him for a trivial injury and set about proving motive. A training blade had nicked the heel of her palm that morning. Not deep, barely enough to merit a dressing. The resident physician had already cleaned it. Silura sent him away and called for the human instead. Martin entered her private study with the composed weariness of a man who had slept too little and expected no fairness from the day. That, in itself, pleased her. "You asked for me, Highness." She held out her hand without explanation. He glanced at the cut. "Has it been rinsed?" "Answer the question I did not ask," she said. "Is this the sort of wound that earns your deepest compassion?" His gaze flicked up to hers and away again. "It earns cleaning and a clean dressing. Compassion's separate." "Is it? Your people seem unable to distinguish between medicine and sermon." He set his bag on the table, opened it, and laid out gauze with irritating neatness. "May I?" She gave him her hand. He did not touch skin he did not need to touch. He held her wrist through the fall of the bandaging cloth and worked with efficient fingers, rechecking the edges of the cut, making sure the prior cleaning had been done correctly. It was difficult to feel demeaned by someone who treated a princess's hand exactly as he had treated a laundry worker's palm. That was another irritation. "You went below for laborers," she said. "Yet here you are, obedient after all. You summoned me. And you came because untreated wounds get stupid infections in fancy rooms as fast as poor ones." She almost laughed despite herself. "You truly do believe rank is only furniture?" "No," he said, tying off the dressing. "I believe bodies are bodies." She leaned back in her chair. "And you enjoy saying such things to me?" "No." The answer came too quickly to be posture. "No," she said. Martin met her eyes then properly for one clear moment. "I enjoy fewer people getting hurt for preventable reasons. The speeches don't do much for me." For an instant she saw not defiance exactly but impatience. Not with her title, with waste. Silura smiled thinly. "You think us wasteful." "I think this palace accepts damage it doesn't have to." He had gone too far. He knew it as soon as he said it. She saw the knowledge settle in him, not fear, but the professional's annoyance at having spoken truth in the wrong room. "Good," she thought, "there you are." "Perhaps," she said softly, "humans accept insolence they don't have to." Martin finished wrapping her hand and stepped back. "Perhaps." She let him stand there while the silence sharpened. Then she said, "Leave the dressing supplies. You have used palace stores often enough elsewhere." It was petty and both of them knew it. He left the supplies anyway. When he had gone, Silura stared at the bandage on her palm. It was smoother than the resident physician's. "Work," That evening Sorrel remarked, in passing, that the human had spent his meal break teaching laundry workers how to rinse caustic salts from cracked hands before the skin opened. "Did you stop him?" Silura asked. "No, it reduces losses." There was that word again, losses. She slept badly. The boundary came at the founding fire procession, and it cost Martin the last of her easy explanations. Every year the oldest service boy in the inner palace carried the first flame from the lower furnace to the ceremonial court. It was a cruel tradition disguised as honor. The chosen child wore polished copper, climbed heated stairs, and walked a route that made full collapse likely if he had been foolish enough to boast beforehand and skip water. They usually did. This year's boy was thin, proud, and gray around the lips before dawn. Martin intercepted him in the staging room and took one look. "No." The boy blinked. "What?" "No procession. You're heat-sick already." A junior steward protested. He was selected. Martin said, "Then select another." By the time word reached Silura, the staging room had become a knot of officials, 2 guards, the trembling boy, and Martin standing between the child and the bronze door to the furnace stair. Silura entered to find Sorrel nearly incandescent. "The human refuses clearance," the chamberlain said, "on ceremonial grounds." "There are no medical grounds for a collapse on hot stairs?" Martin asked. Sorrel ignored him. "The boy can walk." The boy swayed while standing still. Silura took in the scene, the waiting flame bowl, the sweat beading along the child's upper lip. She also took in Martin's face. He was tired again, unshaven at the jaw, and very plainly not moving. "You place yourself in front of royal custom," she said. "I place myself in front of a preventable injury." The room tightened around the sentence. Silura stepped closer, close enough that everyone watching understood the risk he was taking by remaining where he was. "You forget yourself." "No," Martin said, "I remember the boy." The insolence of that should have made the next action easy. She could have ordered the guards to remove him. She could have chosen another foreign consultant before noon. The court would have approved. Her mother would have called it steadiness. Instead, she heard herself ask, "If he climbs, what happens?" Martin did not soften the answer. "He gets dizzy halfway. His blood pressure drops. He drops your ceremonial fire or he falls with it. If he's lucky, he only cracks teeth on the steps." Silura looked at the boy. He was trying desperately to stand like a hero and failing. "You shame him in front of witnesses," she said. "I'd rather shame him than carry him." Then, after the smallest pause, Martin added, "And I won't sign off on a sick child for a spectacle, Highness. Not for you. Not for anyone." There it was. Not pleading, not rebellion, a line. He had given her exactly what she had wanted from the beginning, open refusal. Yet standing in that hot room with the copper reek rising from the stair, she found no satisfaction in it. Perhaps because the boy's knees chose that moment to fold. Martin caught him before he hit the floor. Afterward, the procession went ahead with an older torchbearer and Sorrel's outrage walking beside it like a second official. Martin was formally censured for obstructing ceremony, stripped of his transmission privilege for the next cycle, and ordered confined to assigned quarters when not on direct medical call. He accepted the punishment without speech. That, more than anger might have, kept the matter alive in Silura's mind. Anger she knew how to answer. Silence that persisted after cost had been paid was harder. For 3 days she did not summon him. On the 4th, she went to the memorial garden alone. It had been her father's habit to visit the East Terrace before major court decisions. Nallery had kept the terrace after his death, but drained it of anything that invited loitering. The old fruiting vines were removed. Benches were carved in colder stone. Only one trellis tree remained, its silver leaves hanging above the black memorial slab. Silura liked the place because it made tenderness look foolish. She had just reached the shade when the first tightness seized her throat. At first she thought it was anger returning in the body as it sometimes did. Then her eyes began to water. Her lungs seemed suddenly unable to agree with the air. She touched the side of her neck and found swelling rising under the skin. The gardeners had brought in a ceremonial flower for the founding week, something from the marsh satellites with heavy gold pollen and a perfume like bitter almonds. She had stood near it earlier on the balcony. She had noticed nothing. Now her breath snagged halfway in. Silura tried to call for the guard at the path. What came out was a thin, humiliating rasp. The world narrowed fast after that. Her knees struck stone. One bracelet caught on the edge of the memorial slab. She remembered that absurd detail because the rest became pieces. Silver leaves above her, the taste of metal, the pressure building in her throat, her own hand clawing uselessly at the jewel string across her midriff, because suddenly even that weight felt wrong. Footsteps. Martin's voice, farther away than it should have been. Silura. No title, no time for one. He dropped beside her. She wanted, with the last coherent part of herself, to recoil. Instead, her body pitched toward him because bodies preferred air to dignity. His fingers were at her throat, then her wrist, then the knot of her waist chain. Look at me. She tried. Allergic reaction, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Damn it. He yanked the emergency injector from his kit with his teeth, because one hand was already pulling open the folds at her waist, where the skin lay bare above the skirt. The injector punched into her side. There was pain, then less time, then his hand behind her shoulders, lowering her carefully onto the stone. Stay with me, he said, as if that were a matter of character. Her throat continued closing. Panic, which she despised in others, moved through her in a cold animal wave. Martin rolled her onto her side when she gagged and kept her there while her stomach emptied onto the terrace stones. He did not flinch. He loosened the jeweled collar at her neck, then the ties of her blouse where they constricted breathing. Somewhere in the movement, his bare palm slid against the blue skin of her abdomen. The contact was brief, accidental, intimate only by law. If she had been able to breathe, she might have spent the moment on outrage. Instead, she spent it surviving. Good, he said when air finally scraped deeper. Again. She did not realize she had taken the breath he meant until she heard the sound of it. He sat with her through the shaking that followed. One hand stayed between her shoulder blades to keep her steady. The other held a damp cloth to her mouth after she retched again. There were no witnesses. The guard at the far path had apparently gone to fetch help and gotten lost in protocol. The Queen was not there. Sorrel was not there. The court, for once, could not turn a human act into theater. It was only the princess on the stone, half undressed by necessity and stripped of all useful hauteur, and the man she had fined, belittled, and tried to expose. After a while, the swelling in her throat eased enough that speech became possible. You, she said, then coughed. Don't, Martin said. It was not disrespect, it was practical triage. She tried again later. You touched me. He looked at her as if he had to sort through a great deal of immediate information to find room for the sentence. Yes. No apology, no plea. You knew the law. Yes. Her voice was still raw. Then why? His expression changed very little, but the answer came from somewhere deep and plain. Because you couldn't breathe. Silura shut her eyes. He waited a moment, then added in the same maddeningly ordinary tone, "You can decide what to do about protocol after you can swallow water without choking." A laugh would have torn her throat. Something close to one moved anyway. He made her sit there another hour to watch for the reaction returning. He gave her sips of water only after testing her swallow. He draped his own outer jacket over her shoulders when the post-adrenaline shivering started. He said nothing about gratitude, nothing about debt. When attendants finally came racing up the path in a wave of horror, Martin had already retied what could be retied and stepped back enough for everyone present to remember rank. The astonishment began before the facts were complete. Royal guards had found the human kneeling beside the princess, with his hands on her. The human had injected something into royal skin. The human had loosened her ceremonial dress. The human had been alone with her. By sunset, the palace had produced 6 versions, each worse than the last. Silura should have destroyed him then, if she intended to remain exactly who she had been. Instead, she said nothing. Not in his defense, not against him, nothing. That silence unsettled Sorrel more than any decree would have. He came to her private chamber at dusk with all the careful alarm of a man who had served 3 reigns and trusted none of them fully. "Highness, the matter must be framed." Silura sat before the open window, her loosened black hair falling over one shoulder. Her throat still ached. There was dried bitterness at the back of her tongue she could not rinse away. "What framing do you suggest?" "That the human exceeded his place in confusion, that his intervention will be assessed by the physicians, that any contact occurred under duress and without sanction." Sorrel paused. "And that disciplinary review is underway." Was I dying? The chamber. Lane disliked direct questions. They reduced the space in which politics could soften truth. "You were in severe distress." "That was not my question." He exhaled through the nose. "Possibly." Silura looked out into the courtyard, where torchlight had begun to thread the dark. "He did not hesitate," she said. "No," Sorrel admitted. "Would our own physicians have done the same?" Sorrel chose his words. "Our physicians would have obeyed protocol." Silura turned back to him. For the first time in the conversation, the chamberlain seemed to understand that he had stepped onto ground he could not fully map. That should have comforted her. It did not. After he left, she sat alone with the fact she had resisted all week. Martin Reyes had saved her life knowing the cost might be his own station, his post, perhaps his freedom. He had done it when there was no audience to impress and no promise of reward. He had done it for the same reason he had bandaged a laundry girl and stopped a child on a furnace stair and cleaned vomit off a ward floor. Because there was a body in front of him, and it needed not to be harmed. Silura tried, very seriously, to dislike him for it. She told herself humans were trained into reflex, that this was profession, not character. That competence could mimic kindness so convincingly even the competent person might confuse the two. She told herself saving a princess was inherently advantageous, whatever he pretended. Then she remembered the laundry alcove, the old worker in the ventilation ward, the boy with the ceremonial flame. The way Martin had said, "Not for you, not for anyone." No advantage explained the whole pattern. The next crisis made sure she had no more time to theorize. The founding flower that had nearly killed her turned out not to be merely ornamental. Its pollen mixed badly with the alkaline wash compounds used in the palace laundries. Workers exposed first to one and then the other developed rashes, then wheezing, then fevers from broken skin and infected scratching. What had seemed isolated cases in the lower terraces became, in 3 days, a spreading mess of respiratory irritation, dehydration, and infected hands severe enough to sideline whole shifts. Sarl's answer was immediate and elegant and monstrous. Seal the laundry terraces, restrict movement, prevent contamination of ceremonial cloth, pull replacement labor from outer service barracks, postpone treatment reviews until after the founding guests had departed. In short, hide the sick, preserve the pageant. Martin argued in the council chamber until 2 senior physicians accused him of panic, and one governor's wife complained that a human was raising his voice near silk wallwork. Queen Nallery listened, asking little. Silura listened too. The old version of herself would have found the choice simple. Labor could be replaced. Ceremony, once cracked, announced weakness to every eye in the empire. The court did not judge intentions. It judged whether the surface held. Then a laundry worker stumbled into the outer council hall before the debate was concluded. No one knew how she got past the second gate. Fear made people inventive. She collapsed just inside the bronze doors, gasping. One forearm flayed red from elbow to wrist where she had scratched through inflamed skin. Her other hand, wrapped in grayed, reused cloth, clutched at the tiles. Silura recognized the hand first. The basin girl. Not a girl, perhaps, a woman near 20, but memory had fixed her in that kneeling posture, hair against royal skin. The guards moved to drag her back. Martin crossed half the chamber before anyone else rose. "Don't pull her by the arms," he snapped. "Get water, clean cloth." The woman tried to speak. All that emerged was a tight whine through damaged breath. Sarl stood. "Remove her. This is exactly the disorder I warned of." Martin was already kneeling beside the worker, checking her airway, then the heat of her face. "This is exactly the outbreak you tried to bury." "Watch yourself," Sarl said. The entire hall had gone still. Nobles, envoys, physicians, servants at the wall, everyone waited to see which law would matter more, rank or emergency. The worker's bandage had come half loose. Martin peeled it back and revealed the old fissure in her palm, reopened and now infected, red streaking up toward the wrist. "She kept working," he said without looking up. "Of course she did." Silura could hear, underneath the room's silence, the old machinery of herself preparing. Condemn the breach. Reassert order. Let Sarl have the woman removed. Let the physicians argue technicalities until ceremony was safe. Let Martin be censured for insolence and unauthorized treatment, and if necessary, for touching royal skin. That last charge would solve many problems at once. It would reassure the court that boundaries remained intact. It would warn every watching house that the princess was not compromised by Priva. Weakness. It was all there for her, easy as stepping into a familiar room. Her mother looked toward her once. Not command, not permission, evaluation. Silura rose. The room shifted with her. Martin looked up then, one hand still bracing the worker's shoulder. Sarl inclined his head, already expecting language of firmness. "Highness." Silura heard herself say, "No one is to remove her until she is stable." Sarl blinked. It was a very small change in his face. On anyone else it would have been nothing. On him it was almost naked. "Highness," he said carefully, "this woman has contaminated a council chamber." "This woman," Silura said, "has worked in our salts until her hand opened to the bone because she knew missing a shift cost more than pain. She stepped down from the dais before she fully understood she was doing it." The movement rippled through the chamber like dropped metal. Silura stopped 2 paces from Martin and the worker on the floor, not kneeling yet, not that far, but close enough to feel the fever heat rising from the woman's body. "What is her name?" she asked. No one answered. Silura looked at the woman herself. "Your name." The worker's eyes were wide with terror, with illness, with the unbearable confusion of being asked something no one of rank had previously required. "Annie," she whispered. Silura nodded once, as if this should always have been available information. "Annie will be taken to the East Infirmary, not the service ward. The palace laundries are closed until the wash compounds are changed and the flour stock burned." A collective intake of breath passed through the hall. Sarl said, very low, "The founding procession will be disrupted." "Yes. The governor envoys will speak of instability." "Let them speak accurately then." Queen Nallari's face was unreadable from the high chair. That frightened Silura more than anger would have. Sarl's next move was the one she had known would come. "And the human?" he asked. The chamber tightened again around the question. Martin did not speak. Silura could have saved herself there with one lie. She could have said the treatment would be reviewed. She could have let ambiguity eat him. The court would have done the rest. Instead she said, clearly enough for every envoy and servant to carry it outward, "The human recognized a fatal airway collapse before any of you did, treated it correctly, and saved my life." Silence broke open. One noblewoman made an actual involuntary sound. Somewhere a servant dropped metal. Sarl stared at her in something so near disbelief it almost became pity. "Highness," he said, "you cannot mean to place that in the record." "I do." "Then you also place in the record that he touched a royal body without sanction." "Yes." Martin's head turned a fraction toward her. Not surprise exactly. More like a man hearing a bridge crack under a weight he had not expected it to carry. Sarl pressed, "Do you understand what you concede?" Silura did. That was the point. She understood the whispers already forming. Touched, handled, exposed, saved by an outsider, preserved by hands below the throne. She understood what marriage negotiations might do with it, what rival houses might mutter about purity and authority, and a princess who allowed necessity to cross law. She understood, too, how badly she wanted to take it back now that the room had heard. But Martin was still on the floor beside Annie, keeping pressure on the infected hand, and the old easy cruelty now looked to her less like strength than like laziness. "Yes," she said, "I understand." She turned to the senior physicians. "You will learn the human's treatment protocol for the lower rashes and airway cases before sunset. If your pride slows you, I will replace it with someone else. S. To Sarl, open the east cisterns to service access. Put the order in my name. To the guards, carry Annie carefully, not by the arms." Martin's eyes met hers once before he bent back over the patient. There was no gratitude there that she could see, only focus, and beneath it perhaps the faintest easing of some private tension. That too mattered. The cost came quickly. By evening, 2 allied houses had requested clarification on the princess's condition. By nightfall, a marriage envoy from the southern moons had suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. 3 court families whose daughters had spent years practicing submission in Silura's shadow began, quietly, to count possibilities. Queen Nallari summoned her after the council bells. The queen's private chamber was austere by royal standards. Black wood, low lamps, one wall open to the night gardens. Nallari wore silver rather than gold, which usually meant she had no interest in ornamental softness. "You chose publicly," her mother said. Yes. Nallery studied her for a long time. Was it mercy? Silura thought of Annie on the council floor, of Martin in the memorial garden saying, "Gee, because you couldn't breathe," of her own younger self learning to weaponize distance until it felt like the same thing as intelligence. No, she said at last, it was accuracy. One corner of Nallery's mouth shifted, not amusement, not approval, something more complex and less generous. Accuracy is expensive, the Queen said. I know. Do you? The question might once have driven Silura instantly to defense. Tonight it only made her tired. My father died because he forgot distance, she said. You made sure I never would. Nallery's eyes did not waver. And now? Silura looked toward the open garden, where the silver leaves moved faintly in the dark. Now I think distance can also become a way not to notice what we are permitting. For the first time in years, she saw something like age touch her mother's face. You believe I did not notice? Nallery asked. Silura's throat tightened, though not from flowers this time. I believe you noticed and endured it because endurance kept the throne. Yes. The word landed between them with the force of a closed door. Nallery rose and crossed to the open wall. A ruler is not paid in moral comfort, Silura. She is paid in continuance. Survive first. Be admirable later if the treasury allows. Silura might once have taken that as the last argument in any matter. Tonight it sounded less like wisdom than like a debt that had been collecting interest for too long. I am trying, she said carefully, to survive without becoming too efficient at other people's damage. Nallery turned back, her gaze sharpened. For an instant Silura expected fury. Instead the Queen said, Then you had better learn what that costs before you inherit it. It was not blessing, it was not even truce. But it was not dismissal, and from Nallery that was nearly intimacy. The outbreak took 9 hard days to bend. Martin organized hand-rinse stations near the laundry terraces using plain water before the workers touched alkaline wash. He changed the compounds, ordered gloves stitched from cheap treated cloth, and bullied half the resident medical staff into learning to recognize early respiratory distress before patients turned blue. He slept where he could. He snapped at people who deserved it. He apologized when he snapped at the wrong ones. He made no effort to capitalize on having publicly saved the princess. If anything, he seemed to work harder to avoid court notice now that he had it. Silura watched all of this from the uncomfortable vantage of someone, no longer able to pretend she did not see. Twice she nearly apologized to him and found the idea absurd. Once she attempted gratitude and discovered it sounded like an accusation in her own mouth. What she managed instead was this. She found him outside the East Infirmary at dawn on the 10th day, seated on an overturned crate, eating dry ration bread and staring at nothing. There was a blood stain on one cuff. His hair needed cutting. He looked, for the first time, not steady but simply exhausted. Silura stopped in front of him, N.E. He blinked up at her, orienting. Fever broke in the night. And the others? We'll keep most of them. Most? The word was not cruel. It was arithmetic. Somehow that made it trustworthy. Silura held out the covered cup she had brought. Boiled water, with salt. Martin looked at the cup, then at her. It is not poison, she said. He took it, and because he was tired enough to forget some manners or because he no longer cared to stage them, he said, I didn't think it was. Good. He drank. After a moment he said, You didn't have to bring this yourself. I know. There was a silence in which many things could have been placed and were not. Then Martin asked, "How's the throat?" "Serviceable. Carry the injector if you go near the East Gardens again." She felt the ghost of offense and let it pass. "Are you ordering me?" "I'm telling a patient not to be stupid twice." That would once have earned him 3 levels of consequence. This morning it earned, from somewhere beyond her pride's immediate reach, a sharp breath that was almost laughter. "Impertinent animal," she said. He tipped the cup toward her in faint acknowledgement. "Arrogant patient." It was not friendship. But it was no longer war. The real proof of change did not come in council, or in the memorial garden, or even in the public admission that had cost her suitors and sleep. It came in her dressing room 2 weeks later, when another servant spilled water. The morning was bright, the chamber full, the old habits waiting in their appointed places. Silura stood half-dressed in a sapphire skirt this time, the cloth deep blue against her pale skin, while attendants fixed the chains at her waist and wrists. A new servant, very young, frightened, nearly silent, approached with a heated rinse bowl for the final hand washing. The girl's hands shook. Too much weight, too much audience, too much memory. End the room. The bowl slipped. Water splashed across the floor and over the girl's own feet. She gasped and bent reflexively, the copper rim clipping her palm open as it fell. No one moved. The stillness was exact. It had happened before, in essence if not detail. Everyone knew the script. The girl knew it too. The terror on her face was almost recognition of a story told among servants after lights out. She dropped to her knees at once. "Mercy, Highness." Silura looked down at her. The cut along the palm was shallow, but bleeding freely. The bowl had rolled under a table. A drop of water shone on the blue skin above Silura's waist chain and began to slide. Once she would have used the moment to teach distance. Now she found herself thinking, first and most clearly, hold pressure. As she knelt, the room made a small sound, like a single inhalation shared among too many lungs. Silura took the clean dressing cloth from her own tray and folded it against the girl's palm. "Press." The servant stared. "Press," Silura repeated less sharply. The girl obeyed, shaking. Silura rose and with the toe of her sandal drew the fallen bowl out from under the table. "You," she said to an attendant near the wall, "fetch Martin Reyes, or one of the infirmary staff if he is asleep, and if he is asleep you will not wake him unless the bleeding worsens." The attendants had not yet learned how to absorb altered instructions gracefully. They scattered in visible confusion. Silura looked back at the kneeling girl. "What is your name?" "Pella, Highness." "Good, Pella, keep the cloth there, not too hard." The words sounded almost borrowed in her mouth, but they fit. She took another cloth and wiped the drop of water from her own skin herself. When she straightened, Sorrel was standing in the doorway. He had seen enough. For one long beat, they regarded each other across the room full of listening servants. Then the chamberlain inclined his head. Not approval, not surrender. Recognition. Silura turned back to the attendants. "And boil fresh water before you bring another bowl. If the handles are too hot for steady grip, wrap them." There was a stunned pause. "Yes, Highness," 3 voices said at once. Pella was still staring at her, as if the floor had changed language. Silura almost told her not to, almost said something brisk and distancing to restore the proper angles. Instead she said, "You can stand once the bleeding slows." Pella swallowed. "Yes, Highness." Later, after the room had settled and the second bowl had come without incident, Martin appeared at the threshold with his bag and an expression already prepared for trouble. Silura pointed with her chin. "The patient is there." He looked from Pella to the cloth on the girl's hand to Silura herself. He saw enough. Something moved behind his face, quiet and brief. Then he crouched in front of the servant and said, in the same plain working voice Silura had first heard in the laundry alcove, "Let me see." Silura turned toward the window before either of them could look at her too closely. Below, the palace courts were beginning their day. Servants crossed stone with basins and folded linen. Officials carried tablets. Guards changed shifts. Life went on, which had always been the queen's standard for success. Life went on. Yet the room behind her had altered by some measure no one could enter into record. A servant bled, and fear had not been chosen first. A princess had knelt without dying of it. The world had not become kinder in a morning. Empires never did. But one small mechanism inside it had stopped cutting exactly where it used to cut, and that mattered. When Martin finished bandaging Pella's hand, he rose to leave without ceremony. That, too, had become part of the strange trust between them. Not every useful thing needed to be framed. "Martin," Silura said. He paused. She did not turn from the window. "The rapping." "Fine," he said. Then, after the smallest beat, "Close." Silura nodded once. "Then I will do better next time." She heard him make a sound that might have been agreement, or amusement, or merely breath, and then he was gone. Only when the room had emptied to its ordinary hum did she place her own hand lightly over the place at her side where the injector had entered weeks before, where accident and law and survival had touched the same strip of skin. It no longer felt like contamination. Only skin. Only a body, as he had said, and therefore something that could be harmed or helped by the choices made around it. That knowledge did not make her gentler all at once. It did not loosen every hard lesson her mother had hammered into her. It did not turn court into charity or rank into fiction. Silura was still intelligent enough to know that softness, unguarded, could kill. But cruelty, she had learned, could become a kind of laziness, the easiest answer when one no longer wished to look closely. She had looked closely. Why now? That was harder to undo than any law.